Did you know Glenfiddich is the world's best-selling single malt Scotch whiskey? Actually, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, and Macallan make up 1/3 of the entire single malt market. Scottish whiskies are among the world's most revered spirits, and there are a variety of styles, with some flavored heavily by peat and smoke, while others can be light or fruity. Those are just a few examples, along with many more of what we're going to cover in today's video. I am Kurt Sasek, the president of Wine Taster's Choice, and today I'm going to take you on a tour, virtually that is, of Scotland, which is a lush, beautiful country bursting with green landscapes, lush forests, towering mountains, and its vast lochs, the Scottish word for lakes. History tidbit for you: the first known written mention of Scotch whiskey is from 1494. So how about the basics? First of all, whiskey is a distilled alcoholic beverage made from a fermented grain mash that is strictly regulated with many classes and types. All Scotch whiskey was originally made from malted barley, but then in the late 18th century, commercial distilleries began introducing whiskey made from wheat and rye. When you learn about Scotch, there's a word you're going to hear, and it is peat. What is peat? Peat is a mossy, kind of decaying plant material that was the primary domestic fuel source in Scotland for a long time due to its availability in many parts of the country. Peat is what gives a smoky flavor to Scotch, though not all Scotch whiskeys are smoky. The smoky flavor actually comes from the malting process, where the dried barley absorbs the smoke odor from the burning peat. There are some basic requirements for Scotch whiskey, one of them being that all Scotch whiskey must be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years. The minimum bottling strength, according to regulations, is 40% alcohol. What's the difference between Scotch and whiskey? Geographical location. All Scotch is whiskey, but not all whiskey is Scotch. To be called Scotch, it has to be from Scotland. Like champagne. All champagne is sparkling wine, but not all sparkling wine is champagne because of the geographical classification. Let's talk about the types of Scotch whiskey. There are 2 basic types, and all blends are made from these 2 types. The first one is single malt. A single malt Scotch whiskey is distilled at a single distillery using a pot still distillation process and made from a mash of malted barley. A single grain Scotch whiskey is distilled at a single distillery, but it may also involve grains or other malted or unmalted cereals. Those are the 2 types. Now we'll talk about blends. There are 3 types of blends. First, blended malt Scotch whiskey. This is a blend of 2 or more single malt Scotch whiskeys from different distilleries. The second type is blended grain Scotch whiskey. This is a blend of 2 or more single grain Scotch whiskeys from different distilleries. Finally, we have blended Scotch whiskey, which is a blend of 1 or more single malt Scotch whiskey with 1 or more single grain whiskey. Blended Scotch whiskey is actually Scotland's best-selling spirit, with nearly 90% of the bottles of Scotch sold per year being blended whiskeys. As of 2018, there were 133 Scotch whiskey distilleries operating in Scotland. How many of you watched my video on the Italian wine classification, where I explained how the Italian wine laws regulate basically everything about Italian wine? Well, just like Italy and other European countries have their wine classification systems and regulations, Scotland has their own regulatory system for Scotch. It is called the Scotch Whiskey Regulations of 2009. Here's a question I get a lot. How is Scotch whiskey and bourbon different? Scotch is made mostly from malted barley, while bourbon is distilled from corn. Bourbon is whiskey made only in the USA, generally Kentucky, and there is no minimum period of time for bourbon to be aged. Lastly, bourbon does not use any peat.